Hello and welcome to the Discover History YouTube channel, and today we thought we'd talk about Victorian schooling. And even though I'm not dressed as a school teacher, which I often do when I do Victorian schooling, today I thought I'll show you some of the props that we use when we do it in schools, also when we do it as a talk, and also when we do it as living history. We do like to get into an authentic classroom and act as a teacher with pupils in the classes. So what was education like in the Victorian era? Well, to understand that, you need to look at where education comes from. Now, we know in ancient times, the ancient Greeks, the ancient Romans, even the Egyptians had an education system. However, it wasn't a system for everyone. So it's not like schooling today. And in ancient times, it was usually one tutor and one child. So people would pay to get someone in to actually talk to their child. That eventually changes. It evolves like anything in history, and it's only when you get really to the Middle Ages that you get the first schools. The only problem is these are not schools like we recognise today. We're quite fortunate in Worcester because we had a very good education system that was set up with the cathedral being a cathedral with a monastery. Most monasteries did some form of schooling, and people would often pay to take part in that form of schooling, very much like the King's School is today, which was technically refounded by Henry VIII when the dissolution of the monasteries had closed it in the first place, but not proper schooling. In other words, it was for a minority of people, those with money. So your average person, especially in the Middle Ages, would have been taught how to shear sheep, how to look after chickens, and how to, for example, harness up a horse. That's all they needed to know. They needed practical skills. They didn't really need a full education. But by the Georgian period, some schools associated with churches were beginning to open. And when we start going into the 19th century, at the start of the Victorian era, we also have some factories giving education to factory hands, as they were known, but technically not governed by a law. Worcester, and I will mention Worcester again, Worcester had a carpet factory, not as big as the carpet factory is down in Kidderminster, but we had a carpet factory known as Webb's, and if you ever want to go to where that location was, it's basically on the high street, just set back from the high street in what is known as Bull Entry. Now, they had education for factory hands as such before, way before, all the acts for education that came in. So I like to think, as always, Worcester was very forward thinking again. But we always say, when you look at schooling, really you're looking at schooling technically from the Victorian age. And that's because there was a series of acts that came in which eventually rolled out education for all. Turning children away from employment and pushing them into education instead. Let's improve the lot of the nation, and that was the ultimate plan. Some of the early schools were often known as raggedy schools, and they were often set up by charities, but eventually with these acts we have proper education. Now, there was no computer skills or anything like that, obviously. So when we look at education in the Victorian era, it was usually broken down into what was affectionately known as the 3 R's, the letter R. It's interesting because only one of the R's stands for something beginning with that letter. The other two are completely different words. They don't start with that letter at all, but they're known as the 3 R's. So it consists of reading, that's the only one that begins with a R. We have writing, which obviously everyone will know begins with a W, and then we have arithmetic, which everyone knows begins with an A. So reading, writing and arithmetic. There were extras, I'll mention them at the end, but what were they all about? Well, reading was an important one. Very few children had their own book. The first time even the more upper class children saw a book in many cases was during education, and the books were not like they are today. A lot of the stories have a moral a moral story behind it, very much like Aesop's Fables, which goes right back into ancient Greece, really, to be fair. And you will find that most of the books don't have all the colour pictures that school books have today. But school reading was usually done with shared books. So you would have a book that may be passed around the children, or you may have one book between about 3 or 4 people. And it was usually reading out loud. That was the norm with Victorian children. So learning to read. Then we have writing. Now, writing for the younger years was usually done in a sand tray. So you'd have this small wooden tray. I haven't brought mine with me, but a small wooden tray, bit of loose sand in it, and that was really to practice formulating the letters which would go on to create words. But then the typical thing in the Victorian era was to use what was called a slate. And these are iconic to the point that they were used in some schools even into the 1930s, 40s, and in some cases beyond. They're coming back into schools, not in this format, but in plastic, being a whiteboard. But these slates were very useful because it meant that schools did not waste paper. It was a case of writing on this and then rubbing it out. They never used chalk to write on these. They would use some pencils, which were known as slate pencils, and they are in fact made out of slate. So there's tiny slithers of slate which can be used for writing on a slate. I'll just take one out just to show you. They're basically sharpened pieces of slate. That's what they are, and that's what they would write with. Not chalk, believe it or not. The teachers on their chalkboards would use the chalk and often launch them across the school or across the classroom to naughty children that had a habit of talking, for example. So that was the writing, formulating the letters, and then eventually when the letters were all connected and they knew the alphabet, they would then go on to writing for real. And what we have here is a copybook, and these were used for the neatest and finest handwriting. Sometimes these could be sent away to the local governing body, and these would go into competitions, for example, so the schools, the classes and the individual can win prizes. And these are nothing more than a handwriting book, basically. So what you have often is the alphabet that you have to copy, literally getting all the letters formulated correctly, and then usually there would be passages to copy out at the end. For example, cleanliness is next to godliness, for example. But if you were writing in a copybook, you couldn't use a slate pencil anymore or a piece of chalk as the teacher was. You would then go over to using the dip pen, and we spoke about these when we looked at pens through history. So it's nothing more than the equivalent of a goose feather, a quill. The only problem is now it's wood and iron, and these came with an inkwell that sat on the desk. If you were lucky, you may get the job of an ink monitor, which I have mentioned before, which is very much like someone that was a milk monitor later in history, putting the straws in the milk bottles. It was an honour to be a ink monitor, someone that would sometimes mix the ink, because sometimes it was powdered ink, and then pour them into those little containers and hand them out to the children on the desk. So we've got the reading, we've got the writing, and then there was also arithmetic, which was very much mental arithmetic in schools years ago. In other words, it was quite common to tell children they had this much money, let's say £1, 10 shilling and sixpence, and then they would give them a shopping list, for example, a bucket and a pail, a scrubbing brush, maybe even a flat iron, give them the costings and then say, if you paid that much, what would you get in return as change? Or you may have other types of maths, your typical subtraction, your times tables, that sort of thing. And to assist you in getting those things right, the good old abacus, which has been around for centuries upon centuries, used to do all your workings out years ago. A very useful tool in the classroom, which amazingly has had a comeback. We see them all the time when we're teaching in schools even today. But the school day was quite long. You'd get in very early into school, maybe about 8 o'clock even, and that's usually you would be summoned to school. And the way that was done was usually on school there would be a bell chiming away, and the children would flock down to their local school and wait then for the teacher to come out with an individual bell to call people to line up. And people did it in very military style. When they heard the bell to go to class, they would queue up in regimental lines, sometimes even marching to their class, and then from that point onwards they would be registered. The interesting thing about registers from the past is you can access them now online on some of the ancestry websites, and they are interesting because they're a record of when children attended, but more so you do get the little comments, for example, child absent, helping with harvest, or even things such as child given 5 strokes of the cane that morning. So they are a very, very valuable record, these registers. Absolutely fantastic. But there was other schooling as well. For example, sometimes there would be lessons in geography, and this was very important. For example, here we have a map of the British Empire with all, famously, the pink bits on. We've then got obviously religious studies, very important with children years ago, because what you have to remember is cleanliness is next to godliness. And that's the other thing. When children first turned up to class, they often had to have an inspection of their hands and face and behind their ears to make sure they were clean to attend. But then there was extra lessons. For example, some of the unusual ones, I think, are husbandry. Or housewifery, I should say. Now, housewifery lessons was to prepare the girls in a class for when they leave school, which was usually quite young, about 14, and then go on to make up a home. And this was important to work out the costings of an armchair, the costings of a kettle in the home. It could also include cookery lessons, basic cookery, and also things such as needlework. And this was an important skill. Look at that fine needlework there. These were often referred to as samplers, and these are often collector's items today. Now, I must say here, this was not my embroidery. I am no good at sewing whatsoever. However, this was done by my mom, and she did this several years ago. It was probably about 10 years ago, if that. The 5th of April's on there, and that's because that's my dad's birthday. That's the only reason why it was sewn on there. It wasn't done on the 5th of April. It was just done because that's when he was born. So it's quite interesting that it did set people up ready for the outside world, even though it was not the age of 16, for example. It was much younger than it is today. There was also lessons, for example, on talking about the natural world as well. For example, it was quite common for a class to have a nature table with things like unusual feathers, or maybe some seashells, or even things like a pine cone or a bird's nest. One of the most shocking things, it was quite common for classrooms to have birds' eggs, wild birds' eggs that had actually been blown and then used as a teaching aid. And we do find those in some old Victorian records even today, where museums now have them, and they were from classrooms years ago. Now, if you were a good child working all the way through your long day, you may be given prizes. For example, books were given as prizes, like this one here. This is Ledbury Boys School, so it was a gift for some very good work, for example. They even gave medals, like this one here, for fantastic attendance. If you're good at attending and you attend all the time, you could get a medal to wear around your neck. It encouraged children to compete and get involved in the school and attend all the time regularly, and that was so important. But then there was obviously some naughtiness going on, and for example, some children were given backboards to hold behind their back to stop them fidgeting. These are actually something that sounds quite horrific, known as finger stocks, and these were to stop children fiddling around in class when they were meant to be listening, for example. There was also obviously the cane, which was used on a regular basis, not to just tell a child off, but to actually make the child say the correct answer in the future. And the other shocking thing is all this writing that we've mentioned had to be done with the right hand. It was always seen as a naughty thing to do to write with the left, and that was quite annoying because there was a lot of children out there that were left-handed, and it was quite common to have the left hand tied behind your back to prevent you from using that bad left hand. Left-handed people were not seen upon as good people. Anyway, on that note, hopefully you've enjoyed our little whistle-stop tour about education in the Victorian age, and hopefully your classes are not like this. Anyway, on that note, stay safe, have a fantastic weekend, and we'll see you tomorrow. Bye bye.